Kristin, it's so great to have you back on the World of Difference podcast. Thank you for joining us again today.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's really good to be back.
It is. So much has happened since we last spoke here on the podcast. Your book was sort of a little bit of a baby at the time we first spoke. And that baby turned into just like it grew up and people had a lot of opinions. And, just kind of as you're watching a teenager and people were like, is it a good one or a bad one? We're not sure. But definitely on the podcast here. And from my perspective, it's an amazing book that's still having ripple effects in so many ways and could not be more relevant than it is right now at this very moment. But I think my first question for you, because we're going to talk about a little bit about the effects of Jesus and John Wayne and what the, kind of what you've seen unfold. But at the same time, you have this new documentary, which is incredible for our daughters. I had a chance to watch it with people that I've interacted with quite a bit, or at least Christa Brown has been on the podcast as well. And so just to see this come together with Jesus and John Wayne and kind of the For Our Daughters comment that you kind of made in there, and then this documentary unfolding at this time, it's so important. So I think my question for you is, you've been on a lot of interviews and we have people, I guess, in the field of psychology that are unpacking, the psychology of how a bully forms and then what it does to crowds, when they hear a bully. And then we have the theologians that are unpacking this complementarianism, which lends toward framing men as the decision makers and the leaders, and women are supposed to just submit to them. And then you come in as a historian looking at this Trump as a feature, not a bug, when you have pastors in pulpits who are abusing, and then a president who has been a predator behind a podium. And so as a historian, what is your unique bent and how are you offering something to the conversation?
Yeah, I love how you're opening this, because I'm not a therapist. I'm not a specialist in trauma and recovery, healing. All of those things are so important. But my role as a historian is a little bit different. It really is in unearthing the past and revealing the stories and just describing what has happened and in all of its complexity, and then placing it in historical context, in bringing kind of all of these things together. So gender roles, theology, political context, even economic context, and then just explaining how things work and then putting it out for everybody to see. And so as a historian, my job isn't primarily to say what we should be doing instead, although, I sometimes have opinions on that. And it's also not, as a historian, my job is not to say what true Christianity is or what Christians ought to do. Although I also have opinions on that because I happen to be a Christian myself. But as a historian, I really want to describe as clearly as possible our past, all of the dynamics, and then present that to others to make sense of and see what they want to do with it and how they want to respond to the stories that they now have in front of them.
Yeah, it's so important to understand. And I'm really glad different people are bringing their expertise into the conversation, because, one of the things we talk about here on the podcast is we need a variety of perspectives to understand some of the biggest social problems of our day. And so historians like you really help us look back and make sense of things, and then maybe be able to somewhat know what will happen going forward if we don't change things. And so your documentary that you've helped produce, or that you have produced, is For Our Daughters, and you include voices from especially the SBC community, the Southern Baptist community, where we've seen a lot of abuse cases. It's a denomination I grew up in. It's very close to my heart, even though I'm not a part of that anymore because of the abuse. Many of us have left because of them not dealing with it. But you're giving a voice to women who have not only been abused, but they've also, as they have whistleblowed about that, they've been victim blamed, and they've been, said that, phrases such as "you're trying to bring a good man down," or called Jezebel, or some of the patterns that, you've pointed out. So as you brought, big names that we know about, like Christa Brown, who's been on the podcast, or Rachel Den Hollander, Jules Woodson, and Tiffany Thigpen, all women that are amazing and have been so brave. As you brought them together to do this documentary, what were some of the things you noticed? Were there any more patterns that you felt, got clarified for you?
Yeah, just honestly, the consistency of those patterns. And this is something that jumped out at me years ago when I was researching Jesus and John Wayne, when I didn't set off to write a book or even a chapter in the book about abuse. That really wasn't on my radar. I was writing about Christian masculinity, evangelical masculinity, intertwined with Christian nationalism, politics. And in that historical research, I kept bumping up against stories of abuse. Essentially, the dark side, women's experiences under this harsh patriarchal system. And what fascinated me early on wasn't just, oh, here's a perpetrator, here's a bad guy who's maybe taking advantage of the system, or, you can have different kind of explanatory frameworks for that. And there are bad guys everywhere, as, a lot of people like to remind me. Well, look at Bill Cosby, look at, Harvey Weinstein and stuff. And, but what really struck me when looking at these evangelical cases was this consistent pattern of, in terms of the response of faith communities, to blame the victim. I came across stories, which I recount in Jesus and John Wayne, even of children, young children, being blamed for, quote unquote, seducing their abuser, even their own father. And then wives blamed for not fulfilling their husband's sexual needs so that he had to go abuse their child, right? These sorts of things. And I thought, in what moral universe does this make any sense? It was so shocking to me. And, the first time I came across a story like that, I thought, outlier, right? The second time, oh, right, again, and then again, and again, and again. And I just had to make sense of these patterns. So I did look into the theology that undergirds this kind of boys will be boys mentality and different standards and expectations of sexual morality for men and for women. And there is a long history of that. I looked into the authority and submission. I looked into how many of these women did not have the wherewithal to even identify what was happening to them as abuse, and certainly not to call it out, to fight back. And then I saw, again, in their communities, so many people sided with the perpetrator and felt that they were doing so to protect the church, to protect the man's witness. And it just seemed so twisted. It needed explanation, but it also needed exposure. We had to tell these stories. And with Me Too and the Church Too movement, that's where we get some of these women speaking out. Christa Brown has been speaking out for decades now, a couple of decades. But when I was tracking these women, I was also stunned at, even as they were, with such clarity and moral conviction and just truth telling, they were explaining what had happened. They were not held up as heroes. You didn't have other powerful people in the evangelical community coming alongside them and supporting them and deflecting criticism. You had the opposite. They have been ruthlessly attacked. And all of that, again, it's just stunning. If you move inside these spaces, you start to get used to that. That's just the way it is. I mean, before we released this documentary, all of us in it were bracing ourselves, knowing what was going to likely come our way. But if you just take a step back, you have to say this is reprehensible, and it requires exposure. And the only way we can create new patterns going forward is if we look these, squarely in the eye and come to terms with what brought us to this point.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it does seem so unfair that some of the same women who've been speaking out for years, like Christa Brown, Tiffany, and Jules, and Rachel, all of them collectively for years. Christa Brown obviously being the longest one. But as you watch it just again and again, where they get discredited as whistleblowers, something many who have studied this, whether theologians or psychologists or historians, are pointing out, it is heartbreaking that we haven't seen any sort of real groundswell of people sort of taking this on, that it gets squashed again and again. And, it's so clear for so many of us that this is also what we're seeing in the political realm. So how do you, as a historian, compare what you're seeing in this sort of, especially white evangelicalism, with what we're seeing as white evangelicals that largely supported Trump in 2016 and 2020 could be happening again in this November election as well? How are you seeing those patterns emerge?
Yeah, it was in the fall of 2016, really in the days after the Access Hollywood tape released, that this project that became Jesus and John Wayne really crystallized for me. Because I had been researching evangelical masculinity in the past, had set it aside. I had been tracking, um, because of that research, stories of abuse for more than a decade by that time. But in the days after Access Hollywood, if you recall, everybody was asking the pundits, evangelical leaders themselves, like surely this is a bridge too far for his evangelical supporters. This was just weeks before the 2016 election. They can't possibly support a man who is now on camera bragging about assaulting women. Well, we know what happened. A couple of his evangelical supporters ever so briefly wavered. Wayne Grudem was one of them. But then he prayed about it, and by the end of the week, he was back supporting Trump. And everybody was asking, how could evangelicals betray their values, these family values evangelicals, to vote for a man like Donald Trump? That's when it clicked for me. Like, we have seen this pattern before. We have seen this pattern so many times before inside their own churches, inside their own organizations, the trade-offs they are willing to make to support powerful men that they think are doing God's work in the world and protecting that powerful man, even when he is a predator, and marginalizing, ostracizing, demeaning, denouncing the Christian women who are speaking truth and speaking truth to power. And that's when the project that became Jesus and John Wayne really clicked for me. And so the political framing here is simply consistent with the framing that has always been around this story. And in fact, if you look at survey data, we have so much survey data out now on Christian nationalism. People who believe that this should be a Christian nation, our laws should reflect it, Christians should be privileged and in power. We have that, all of those things closely correlate with gender traditionalism, patriarchal ideals, and you can just see across the board, these are tightly connected. And then in addition, we have some of the figures who have spoken out most prominently against abuse reform inside the SBC are also some of the leading Christian nationalist voices with close ties to the former and they hope future Trump administration. And you have somebody like Doug Wilson, not in the SBC, but this is not limited to the SBC, who is, one of the kind of most influential teachers when it comes to this rigid patriarchy, who is also one of the loudest voices championing Christian nationalism today. And all of these men are tightly networked with each other and politically, with ties to contributors to Project 2025 and to the Republican Party and the MAGA faction, right? It's all right there. And as a historian, I'm simply describing what is right in front of us.
Yeah, as you mentioned this before, also when you're in the podcast, how your research sort of started in this toxic, I guess, militant masculinity that you were seeing emerge in evangelicalism, and a lot of it had to do with books and conferences. And so your book, resonated with so many people that were either a part of that or watching from the sideline and trying to make sense of what it was, and then just seeing that history lead us to Trump, right? And so, what you sort of described as this tightly networked group of men. And maybe it would be helpful to unpack sort of what that looks like. I mean, bro clubs are here in Silicon Valley and tech, or you have what they call good old boy club, in the South maybe. That's in DC politics. It's in a lot of realms. But what's unique about this for maybe just, evangelical pastors in these worlds that end up becoming, I don't know, they have childhood trauma and that leads to maybe some narcissism. We've had Chuck DeGroat on here unpacking that part.
Yes.
But how does this sort of bro club work uniquely?
First, let me quick point out that some of the evangelical, kind of networks now are meeting up with the Silicon Valley bro culture, right? We see that with Peter Thiel and JD Vance and connections here. So that's not good. It's not a good thing at all. But so with that, what does it look like specifically inside these evangelical communities? It looks like, the power of Christian publishing, of these publishers that then can give authors huge platforms. It looks like organizations like the Gospel Coalition, enormously powerful in shaping particularly fellow Christian pastors, whether they're evangelical or not, right? This massive platform, and it's a global platform as well. And you've got denominational kind of hierarchies and men's club, and here the SBC is the strongest, the most powerful. But you've also got these networks moving out through homeschool communities, homeschool networks, and this is where Doug Wilson plays a really prominent role in those spaces. And then you have these religious networks, which, by the way, are also kind of hierarchical. Even though it's all like brother this, brother that, there's a pecking order there too. So if you want to have your book picked up by a major Christian publisher and sell all those copies, if you want to be invited to speak on the main stage at the Gospel Coalition and have that audience and all the book sales and so forth that come from that, if you want to move from a mid-sized church to a bigger church, you've got to follow the rules. And you've got to show deference to the men who have more power than you. And then it's expected that those underneath you show deference to you. Right? That's kind of how this culture works. And so it has its own kind of built-in disciplinary mechanisms that aren't just like coercive discipline, but it's also like willingly submitting to those with authority. That's how this whole structure works, men to men as well. And then if you do, you are rewarded with more power and with more perks. So you've got all of these networks that have been building for a very long time, and there is a lot of money involved here and a lot of power, and they are doing it all in the name of Christ, right? This is the Gospel Coalition. It's not the Gospel Coalition, it's a complementarian club, right?
Right.
But then now, so we've been seeing that coalesce for decades now, also mapping onto and intersecting with political networks. Organizations like Focus on the Family with their Family Research Council, organizations like the Council for National Policy, right? You see these very tight alignments there. And then one more thing I will say, so this is the reality that we live in. This is the like structure behind white evangelicalism today. But then you also have power dynamics inside those spaces. And I track that some in Jesus and John Wayne, and even since the book has come out, right, I'm talking about the shift of what is mainstream and what is fringe or what is extremist. And I trace through the character of Doug Wilson in my book, somebody who was undeniably fringe in the 1990s, becoming more and more mainstream. And now you've got the quote unquote mainstream organizations like Christianity Today, Wheaton College, feeling the pressure from these factions on the right. You even have the Gospel Coalition taking a lot of hits from more right-wing factions within the SBC and in the Wilson orbit. So it's fascinating to watch these networks and alliances as they evolve and shift, and to see those power dynamics play out.
It is fascinating and a bit terrifying, if I'm being honest, because when we see something that is fringe becoming more mainstream, that does kind of, set off all the alarm bells for many reasons. We had Tia Levings on here with her book, The Well-Trained Wife. And, she talks about growing up in this Southern Baptist church, which incidentally had Jerry Vines, who's a part of Tiffany Thigpen's story.
Tiffany's church. Yes.
Yeah,
they were in the same youth group.
They were, and they're friends. So in the wild world where those kind of things connect, and at the same time, I think that when we look at these sort of bro clubs, good old boy clubs, where they kind of scratch each other's backs and, announce each other on stages, you unpack a bit of Mark Driscoll and Jesus and John Wayne. And, that was an aspect that was sort of SBC adjacent as well, but he's definitely been welcomed in a lot of those circles and all of that kind of thing. But it just seems as though, women's voices get squashed or easily discredited. And,
yes.
Sometimes we look at narratives in our society that are based in stereotypes or sexism, misogyny, racism, those kind of things. But when those familiar narratives get tapped into, and it seems like that's what Trump's really great at, is saying little words that almost feel like a dog whistle, saying things that might call out people whose family have been a part of very racist and terrorist organizations like, the KKK, for example, and saying things that sound familiar to what their great grandparents and grandparents may have passed on, as well as within, sexism. There's a lot of narratives in society that will easily paint a woman as a Jezebel, as a temptress. Those aren't just evangelical narratives, although they are magnified in an evangelicalism, which will say, God speaks to the men who make the decisions, and women must submit, even when he's a David who's abused Bathsheba, right? And so when you have these stories within the scriptures, those ring true, and then therefore make congregations or denominations side with the man. So how do you see some of those patterns emerging or making some connections there?
Yeah, you just see the default reaction, the default response seems to be, keep it quiet. Like, that's always the first. Did you tell anyone? As when Tiffany brings her story, Tiffany and her mom, to her pastor. Wait, did you tell anybody? No, I'm just coming to you. Okay, good. Keep it that way. Right. So this silencing, this protecting, this circling the wagons, rather than rooting out. Right. You would think that, given Christian teachings and about sexuality and purity and truth telling and like all the things, you would think the very first step would be, do justice. Let's get rid of abuse in our spaces because it harms people we love and it harms the witness of the church. I mean, it destroys that witness. And instead, that's not what you see over and over again. It's to protect the witness, quote unquote, of the church, that this cover up ensues and is carried on, and the punishment is meted out, and that silencing and marginalizing takes place, which has to make you wonder what are they actually protecting? Right. And so many of us who have been exposing these stories of abuse are accused of trying to destroy the church, or they like to put it in the language, very gendered. You're destroying the bride of Christ. I'm like, no, we're not. You all are. Right. Like, and Rachel Denhollander is so good on this. In the film, and also in Jesus and John Wayne, I quote her on this really powerful quote that she said in her victim statement in the Nassar case, when she was talking with Larry Nassar, who was also trying to kind of get cover by saying forgiveness and Christianity and stuff. She said, the gospel of Jesus Christ does not need your protection. Right? All that we are asked to do as Christians is to obey. And what does that look like? To do justice and to tell the truth. That's it. It is that simple. And that, I think, is that I've always looked to as the moral center of Jesus and John Wayne. There's a lot of bad stuff happening in that book, a lot of corruption. There is a moral center there. It's tell the truth and do justice. Just do that. And I don't know why it's so hard to do that inside these spaces where the default response is almost invariably to protect the perpetrator if he is a powerful, quote unquote, man of God.
Yeah. It seems as though over and over again we see, and, Sarah Stancorb, when she was on the podcast, talked about this, outside of evangelical world, people really can't wrap their minds around standing ovations for perpetrators. None of us should be able to wrap our minds around that, but you have a scene like that, right? For Jules Woodson and her story, and over again we see that happen, and it just it turns out even the story of a woman being abused by her pastor, like Christa or any of these women, we still center the man in these circles. So it's what is his perspective on what happened. So what's so beautiful about what you've done is you've centered every one of the survivors, and just a survivor-centered approach is not a pattern we've seen. It's not something that's being almost even considered. It feels like an alien ship if try to land it there. It feels so foreign to these systems. What is your perspective on the survivor-centered approach that you brought into for our daughters and what it means for them?
Yeah, I mean, that's really why this film exists. As we were, the director and I were, initially we're doing some of these interviews as part of what we envisioned to be a larger project connected to Jesus and John Wayne. And so this was going to be a portion of that. But very quickly, in hearing these stories, in those very early interviews, we were both blown away, as was the cinematographer, right, running the cameras, and like just the power of their stories and the clarity that they bring now to these stories. We were just, it was stunning. And I've moved in these spaces a long time. I'm familiar with the basic contours of their story. And even then, even knowing the details, hearing it spelled out, right, in their own words, so powerful. And it occurred to me that so much that's out there around these issues in evangelical spaces gets muddied very quickly. And that's intentionally so, right? It's a deliberate strategy to try to undermine and to discredit and to complicate and even, you know, stories that try to center victims. If you're just having a little piece of the story here and a little piece of the story there, which is, you know, kind of what journalism tends to do, you miss the full power of it. And what we found is just sitting in those rooms, like face to face, and just letting them talk and tell the stories, we were blown away. So I was, as somebody who's familiar with this, the rest of the film team who is like kind of coming in from the outside, absolutely stunned and so incredibly moved by their courage and their clarity. And that's really the inception of this film. It was just, we realized what we had was so powerful, and the power came from the women themselves. And all we wanted to do was amplify that because we've seen the power that's been marshaled against them. Big organizations, very powerful organizations within denominations and denominations themselves have been marshaled against these very women. And we thought, you know, you can't really, it's really hard to kind of take on each and every, you know, attempt to discredit and this and that. You'll just, you know, there's no end to that.
Right.
But what we can do is let them tell their stories. And this is the truth, right? And, you know, trust me on this, like, it's not just a believe woman situation. Like, these are thoroughly vetted stories, well-documented stories. And the film itself went through a very meticulous legal review. So, you know, all of these, well, he said, she said, we don't really know. We know.
Yeah, we know. And I totally wholeheartedly resonate with that because of having heard so many survivor stories myself. I told somebody recently, I know way too many predators. I don't think it's normal. But I mean, when you've grown up SBC in Southern Baptist world, and we've seen these, you know, stories come out in the Houston Chronicle with Robert Downan's reporting, and then you just realize over the years you start to kind of count like, oh, these missionaries that I grew up with, or these missionaries that I knew overseas, or these pastors, like I just know too many. I know way too many, and that's not normal. But it somehow becomes normal in that world, which is why I had to step out, because that's not normal. And it's also doing a disservice to the men who have preyed upon women themselves, because they won't know how to stop themselves. Like making this assumption that somehow because of complementarianism or even the egalitarian spaces within evangelicalism, I have come up against the, you know, there's abuse within that, which is shocking to some people. But even within that, when you have a world that centers men, even if you believe women can preach and be pastors, men are still being centered. Their power is still being protected. And that's not even good for those men. And so even though your film is for our daughters, I would say it's for everyone, because this whole notion of protecting somebody who can't stop themselves, who may have had some sort of childhood trauma or whatever, and then they landed in evangelicalism that told them they were the center and they would be protected, and they, whatever their locker room talk is or whatever theologies they say about some of the stuff that Sheila Gregoire, you know, who's been on a couple times, unpacks, where, you know, men's quote unquote needs, which aren't needs, are supposed to be met by their wives. And if they're not, then, you know, of course they abuse so-and-so, right? And so that system isn't working for the men. It's not working for the women. It's not working for the children. And so I think For Our Daughters is a great name, because I have a daughter and I think we should do this for them. But honestly, it's for all of us. So how do you see that?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought up Sheila Gregoire's work too, because and we have her book, one of her books on our recommended resources, but I could really put all of her books on our recommended resources. Yeah. But what's funny is that we connected years ago. And after I had written Jesus and John Wayne, and she was just finishing the Great Sex Rescue, And she had asked me to endorse, and I got that manuscript, and I just went through and thought, we literally were quoting from the same books going back to the 1960s. We had done the same research without knowing about it, and we had drawn the same conclusions. And so it was this really powerful moment. And as I was reading that manuscript, I thought, oh, this would have been so nice to have what I was researching, because it would have saved me so much time, because we saw the same things, and we both had to read all those horrible books. So, but yeah, for our daughters, that the title had kind of two sources of inspiration. One was, as we were thinking about a title, actually the working title that we were using for a while was The Handmaid's Rebellion. So, that it covers it as well, a slightly, different kind of sensibility there. But, we're thinking how do we appeal to our target audience, which is actually Christian women, and Christian women still in this space. And we weren't sure if the Handmaid's Rebellion would actually resonate, that knowing that, that Margaret Atwood's book wouldn't be as well known in these spaces. And, we don't want to repel up front. But, I'm usually fine with that. I don't try to sugarcoat things. But one of our team said, just came up with a list, and on that list was for our daughters. And, and that had come from the fact that at least two of the participants on camera had said, what was it that compelled them to become an advocate here, to become that whistleblower? And it wasn't until they had daughters of their own that they could then recognize what had been done to them, and that they could recognize that it was ridiculous to take on the blame. It was ridiculous to take that on. And they could see how young they were, and they could see just how wrong that was. And so when that kind of floated up, immediately it reminded me of a conversation that I've had that has just been close to my heart since this was briefly just months after Jesus and John Wayne came up. And a group of 3 conservative evangelical women reached out to me. They wanted to do a Zoom conversation. And I was aware of who these people were, somewat prominent in conservative spaces. So I said, sure, but I kind of thought they were going to bring a critique, right? Because I knew them as quite conservative. But they wanted to meet privately. So we got on Zoom, and they were not at all bringing a critique. They just said, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And then they said, we can't go back, and it's too late for us. We've made the choices, and we're living with the lives that we've made. But we want something different for our daughters. What can we do to help? That just absolutely, it was so moving. And I've carried their words with me. So that combination of hearing that kind of bubble up from the participants' words themselves, it was for their daughters. And then reminding myself of that, women themselves who are caught up in these systems, right? It is so hard to extricate yourself. And these systems shape who you are and your possibilities. But we do want to disrupt that system and give options and give a path to change, because we do not want these patterns to persist.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't. So my last question for you is, some people are still undecided in the United States right now, whether they live abroad as U.S. citizens or they live here in the United States. I know I saw yesterday, my friend Amy Allison that started She the People has some new data that talks about Asian American women and Latina women who are very undecided right now. And some of them are in evangelical communities that might be mostly white evangelical, but have a bit of diversity in them. And it can be a little confusing. And so as a historian, as you're looking at, people are about to watch, vice presidential debates and we're looking back and seeing what people are saying, what are some things people should be looking for as they're considering, the weight of a nation in this, in light of all we're talking about?
Yeah, voting is a very complicated act, and democracy is very complicated, and then a two-party system, right? Especially so. So, it's highly unlikely that you're going to find a party that aligns 100% with all of your values, and so I want to acknowledge that and acknowledge that complexity, and everybody has to take factors that are important to them into consideration. But I would like to suggest that these are some of the factors that they take into consideration. The treatment of women, what kind of future do you want for your own daughters? And if you are in a church space, right, you can engage in that space. But one of the messages of this film is that this is not just about what happens in churches, that these very men who have been creating this whole system and perpetrating some of these acts of abuse and certainly giving cover to friends of theirs who are perpetrators, these same men are the ones who are pushing this Christian nationalist agenda. An agenda which, if you read their own documents, you can see is all about consolidating power to achieve their ends. It's that same abuse of power. But the problem is, if it happens on a national scale, it is very, very hard to undo. And so for me, I am kind of engaging in the political sphere, not because I'm particularly partisan, but as a historian, I have a deep respect for and appreciation of democracy. And I think that democracy is so important to protect the rights of the vulnerable. And when you hear phrases of, no, women shouldn't have the vote, and no, a woman is under her husband's absolute control, and so are their children, and these sorts of things, and you see it borne out in the political realm and their political agenda, a lot of red flags for me. And so I think that this election is extremely important because, historically speaking, if you allow democracy to erode, as many experts on democracy are predicting will be the case if Trump is once again back in the White House, it can be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to recover that within even a generation. Right? And so I think that we need to have a solid democratic foundation within which then we can have our ideological debates and our, fight about different political views on a whole host of issues. But without that strong foundation and that kind of protection of constitutional rights of all Americans, not just those who hold your particular version of, Christian faith, all Americans, we are moving into extremely dangerous territory that's bad for the country, and I would say very bad for Christianity as well.
Yes, absolutely agree. And, friends around the world who aren't U.S. citizens are concerned. So this is an opportunity for us to do something great for the world as U.S. citizens as we vote. Thank you so much for being on. I'm going to ask you to stay on to ask you another question. But yes, thank you for just your insights. And this film is so important. And so we're going to link that in the show notes for people to watch. But thank you for all your time and effort and just for centering the voices of survivors who have so often been squashed in this whole mess of evangelicalism and politics and everything that gets intertwined. Thank you so much for the work that you do, Kristin. How can people find you and more of your writing and your work?
I write fairly often over on Substack, so you can find me at Du Mez Connections on Substack. And also, for any more information on the film, For Our Daughters Film.com is your destination. And we have a lot of resources there, further reading and organizations you can connect to if you yourself are a survivor, or if you want to bring better practices to your own faith communities, or help people in your lives who have experienced this sort of abuse. So lots of resources there as well.
Thank you, Kristin. Thank you so much for all the difference that you're making.
Thank you.